I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to the Insider Insight Show. I am honored to have back with me someone who is a very dear friend and someone who is one of the dearest friends to freedom and liberty for every person of our world, Harley Schlanger. Harley is on the tip of the spear when it comes to every person of the world's freedom and liberty. His interests are the interests of the world and the safety and security of the world. And unfortunately, one would think that that would win you a Nobel Prize. But these days, all it does is earn you targeting by the syndicate and their puppets because they do not want you to know the truth. Because if you know the truth, then you might want to end their reign of terror, not error, their reign of terror that they have been hoisting upon the worldwide public for decades. And that's what Harley has dedicated his life to, is ending the syndicate's rule of terror. Harley has been a spokesman for the LaRouche organization since 1999. Harley has written extensively on a number of issues, including financial fraud, going all the way back before it was actually even fashionable, back to the 1980s and the savings and loan crisis. He's also covered the effects of banking deregulation, the shift of the United States from a productive manufacturing economy to a speculative casino economy. And Harley's often interviewed on not only this platform, but many, many radio shows around the world. And on various topics ranging from financial fraud to reversing the crisis with the return to the American system of physical economics. He also has lectured widely throughout campuses throughout the United States and Europe. His website, laroucheorganization.com. It is my honor to welcome back one of the top geopolitical experts and analysts in the world, Harley Schlanger. Harley, welcome back to the Operation Freedom platform.
Hi, Dave. Good to be back with you.
Well, Harley, today we're going to focus on the merchants of chaos, control, conflict, and casualties. And right now, there are two spheres that we need to address. That being your take at this point on the Russia-Ukraine situation. And now we have yet another war in the Middle East. So Harley, you are brilliant at connecting the dots and drawing everything into focus for folks. I look forward to your analysis.
Well, this is one of these strange occasions where Joe Biden actually helped us by talking about linkage between Ukraine and the Middle East. Now, I think the important thing I'll just say as a preface is that I don't think most Americans have any clue, and certainly not Europeans, that when we're talking about, whether we're talking about Gaza or Ukraine, we're talking about situations that have been developing over years. Mm-hmm. The Ukraine crisis didn't start in February 2022. Gaza didn't start in October 7th. These are things that have been set in motion over many, many years. And I don't mean this like a simple conspiracy theory. No. I mean as products of imperial rivalries. Mm-hmm. The Middle East in particular, because the current configuration of nations and entities in the Middle East goes back to the middle of the 19th century, when the British realized that the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, that is the Turkish Empire. And their fear was that the Russian Empire could come down from the north, the German or Austro-Hungarian Empire from the west, and that the two threats were to what? British control of the seas. Mm-hmm. If you look at a map, why is it called the Middle East by the British or Southwest Asia? Well, it's in between Asia, Africa, and Europe. And it's also on the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. These were prime concerns of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And when the Germans started contracting the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, this wasn't about oil. It was about who would control the land routes, who would control the terms of trade. Similarly, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and in fact, the Russia-British confrontation goes back to the 1840s and 50s with the Great Game in Afghanistan. They were fighting over Afghanistan before anyone had ever heard of Taliban or strategic minerals. Mm-hmm. It had to do with geography. So this is important for people to realize, because what we're seeing now is the end phase of an era of empires. The last empire is the Anglo-American Empire. And I bring up Anglo as a part of it, not because the British are so powerful. They can't even get a ship out of dock right now without the U.S. towing it. But they have developed a script. They write the narratives. They run the psychological warfare, and they control the think tanks that run the Biden administration, that ran the Obama administration, that was constantly at war with Trump, and that, of course, ran the two Bushes and Clinton. So we're dealing with an entity which has chosen to move toward a new order based on control in the hands of corporate cartels. And the corporate cartels, the biggest corporate cartel, of course, is banking. The City of London, Wall Street, the Federal Reserve System, the central banks, and so on. And these are the people who have had their way for most of the last half century. And by that, I mean, they, through the International Monetary Fund, they determine whether countries can get credit. They determine whether you can get credit as an American through their control of the Federal Reserve. And what's happening now is that countries around the world are saying, wait a second, why should we dig up our raw materials for your corporate cartels when we get nothing? We've seen a whole series of coups in West Africa, kicking the French out. It's long overdue. One of the last colonial areas is the Middle East, where the Israelis function as an operation as part of the British Empire. And, you know, when people try to reduce this to Jews versus Muslims, they don't understand. Someone's playing that from above.
That's right.
It's the puppets that are going at each other and are getting armed by both sides. And what's the target? The target is to prevent this new system from coming into existence that's outside of the control of the dollar. And so when you hear terms like de-dollarization, or what are the BRICS doing, why do Russia and China have a relationship, we're looking at an end to this imperial order which says Washington, London, and Brussels will set the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, what Blinken calls the rules-based order, and I don't think Blinken has any idea what a real rule is, but what's the rules-based order? We tell you what to do. And if you don't do it, we cut your credit, we organize color revolutions, assassinations, and if necessary, wars. And that's what we saw happen to Gaddafi. That's what we saw happen to Saddam Hussein. They tried to do it to Assad. They're trying to do it to Putin and Xi Jinping right now. The problem is Putin and Xi Jinping are in countries that are powerful. Russia is probably the premier nuclear power in the world. China, if it hasn't surpassed the U.S. in total economy, it's going to soon. And so you can't just dictate to these countries. They believe in the idea of sovereignty. So you can say to Niger or Botswana or Thailand, you have no sovereignty, you'll do what you're told. But you try to do that to Putin, and you're going to get a blowback. And so that's where we are in the world right now. And Biden is, at best, a simpleton who's been given orders to continue these wars. And so you see the whole world is looking at the United States right now and saying, what's wrong with America? You send Blinken over here to say, well, we want to make sure you treat the Palestinians humanely. And then say, but we give Netanyahu full go-ahead and arm him to the teeth to do whatever he wants to do. And the rest of the world is saying that's not acceptable anymore. Now, the rest of the world can't stop Netanyahu yet. They may be able to. There may be some things that they're going to do. They're trying to use diplomacy, but it's hard to have diplomacy with a thug.
Very true.
So I think what people have to realize is if you step back, we're seeing an empire crumbling. Its axioms are proven to be false. And we're seeing the rest of the world saying, what is the potential for us if we break out from under this empire? And this is where America still has a role to play, because our constitutional system, our American system of physical economy, is what most of these countries would like to replicate, but they don't know how to do it. And instead of helping them, we're treating them the way the British treated their colonial subjects for centuries.
No, it is falling apart at the seams, Harley. And even though those people here in the United States, a show of how freedom conscious you were was to put the Ukrainian flag outside of your house.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have one person in our community that has continued to fly this Ukrainian flag until this morning. I'm out for my morning walk, and all of a sudden, this guy who's been up there for a year and a half is taking down the flag, and has been upset with a number of us who have pointed out, no, whoa, what's going on over there? Let's go back in time. As you said, this is not something that started in February 2022 with Russia, right? I go, well, let's just go back short term, like 2014. And that Maiden agreement that was essentially a sham, that was led to a coup, Obama CIA induced coup of an elected government in Ukraine. Why are you taking the flag down this morning? Well, you've said all this stuff about Zelensky, and he decided that there aren't going to be any elections, and did you hear, like, the second in command in the military got a grenade got blown up as a present in his house, and so I'm not I have to I've been rethinking things. I've been rethinking things for the past day, and I can't keep flying this flag.
See, Dave, that's interesting because that's what the empire fears the most.
Yes.
What Lyndon LaRouche used to call the American Reflex.
Yeah.
The Americans are somewhat ignorant of international policy and economics. We've been somewhat cushioned by the situation where we are protected by two oceans. We've had a prosperous history. And so people have stopped thinking about the big issues. Mm-hmm. But if you push Americans hard enough, mm-hmm. if you tell them that the economy is going great when they see people barely can make ends meet, when you tell them, don't worry, we're beating Russia in a war, when all you see is the destruction of the young people in Ukraine, mm-hmm. and we're paying for it. Yep. We're paying for running their government. Mm-hmm. We can't keep people in housing in the United States. People are living under bridges all over the country. We can't protect our own border. We can't run the trains without having one derailment a week or two derailments a week. And yet we're spending $113 billion, which is all gone from the original Ukraine allocation. So Biden comes back and says, oh, things are going pretty well. We knew that the counteroffensive would be slow. No, they sold the counteroffensive as this will be the blow that will force the Russians to give up the land. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's forced Zelensky to draft 50-year-old women into the army. Mm-hmm. So the Ukraine situation is coming to an end. And fortunately, there are people in the Republican Party who drew a line on this. Mm-hmm. And basically said, well, we can't protect our border. We can't pay for things. We have a $33 trillion deficit. I don't want to spend another $100 billion on Ukraine. Now, they'll still say stupid things, though, like Putin's a dictator. Putin, well, maybe he'll run over Europe, but that's not our problem, because they just don't know yet. But they have a sense that they're not being told the truth. Mm-hmm. And that's why, I like to come on programs with you, because you're out to get the truth to people. You want to make sure that people have at least an inkling mm-hmm. that they're not getting the full story. And once someone gets that,
that's right.
There's an old proverb, the truth never dies, but it lives a wretched life. But if you keep the truth alive mm-hmm. and inspire people to dig for themselves, to discover what's going on,
that's right.
then the Americans will step up, as they did in the American Revolution, as they did in the Civil War, as they did in World War II. But since World War II, we've been going in the direction of the empire. And it's of no benefit to us. The idea of a sovereign nation that's giving up its industry, giving up its scientific and technological edge, that's not going to work.
No.
Especially when you have countries like Russia that are developing new generations of hypersonic weapons almost every month. The Wall Street Journal had an article about a month ago. Why can't we build hypersonic weapons? And they had all these excuses about too much bureaucracy. People don't know what the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. All these simplistic things. What it left out is the United States has been destroying a real science education, engineering education.
That's right.
And replacing it with sports, entertainment, and social media. And the scientists working in U.S. labs are from China, Japan, the Philippines, Cameroon. There's space programs now in Africa that, with the exception of what Elon Musk is doing, they're going to be outstripping the United States soon. Mm-hmm. So we've gone into a hole of delusion. Mm-hmm. Now, on Ukraine, Time magazine has an article this week quoting a number of advisors to Zelensky. And they say, we can't tell him the truth because he is deluded. They use that term deluded, that he believes he's going to win this war. Mm-hmm. And so, it reminds me of the old joke when the Politburo was sitting around in the Soviet Union and Stalin dropped dead. They sat there for a few minutes, not sure what to do. And then a doctor went over and checked his pulse and he said, I think he's dead. And someone said, well, who's going to tell him? That's the Zelensky problem.
Yeah, it is.
Now,
that's good.
The same thing with Biden.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that Biden is so addled that he doesn't realize that some of the things he's saying make no sense. Like we want a humanitarian pause, but not a ceasefire. We want to protect children, but we have to crush the terrorists. Well, we've killed 4,000 children. By we, I mean the Israelis. I actually should say the Netanyahu regime has killed 4,000 children. Do you think that's going to stop terrorism, or do you think that's going to ensure the cycle of violence continues?
It enhances the cycle and magnifies it significantly.
Yeah.
Harley.
And you look at the one time there was a chance for Mideast peace was when Rabin and Arafat shook hands. Mm-hmm. Two people who were enemies, who fought each other. Rabin was the commander of Israeli forces in the 67 war when they took all the occupied territories. He defended those territories, but not the way Netanyahu wanted to. Netanyahu, Shamir, Begin, they said, let's have huge settlements in the territories so we create what Sharon called facts on the ground. That is, that there's so many Jewish settlements in this area, it's no longer a state. It can't be a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. Rabin said, look, we need some defense outposts, but that's not where we should be living. And then when the Intifada started in December 87, where young children were throwing rocks at the Israeli police and soldiers, and the initial impetus for Rabin was to go in and hit them hard, demolish some homes, expel some people, put some people in jail, but his heart wasn't in it. And he came to conclude that this is not the way to have peace. Mm-hmm. The problem was Shamir was the prime minister, and Shamir was saying, we're not going to negotiate with the Palestinians. So a funny thing happened. Bush and Baker were asked for $10 billion to help build more settlements in Israel. And then Shamir said, well, do it as a loan guarantee. So James Baker said to them, we'll only do it if you try to make peace with your Arab neighbors. So they had a conference in Madrid that started in 1991. But it didn't go anywhere because Shamir didn't want it to go anywhere, just like Netanyahu doesn't want a two-state solution. Mm-hmm. But Rabin won the 92 election, and he sent his top young economists to Oslo to meet with some top people from Arafat. And they came up with an agreement. And this is something Americans still don't know what really happened. They remember the picture of Arafat and Rabin shaking hands in front of Clinton at the White House. Oslo included an economic annex, which was essentially drafted by Lyndon LaRouche, called the Oasis Plan. LaRouche started working on this in the mid-'80s. The idea that the solution to peace in the Middle East is you need more water. There's not enough water from the River Jordan to take care of Jordan's needs, Palestinian needs, Israeli needs, Northern Arabian Peninsula needs, Egypt, and so on. But what LaRouche proposed, and Shimon Peres liked this idea, dig canals between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea and the Red Sea and the Dead Sea. Put nuclear power plants, 300 megawatt nuclear power plants, along these canals to desalinate water and to provide electricity for economic development. Bingo. The Palestinians liked it, the Israelis liked it, and so this is what was behind Oslo, 2 economic annexes. But what happened? Well, I think you probably know the story. The World Bank, which was supposed to be raising the funds to pay for this, refused to let the funds go to the Palestinians because they said, we don't trust Arafat. He'll just use it to buy weapons and for corruption. So they had no money to move the earth and get the project started. And then an extremist shot and killed Yitzhak Rabin 28 years ago last Saturday. And there was no one else who could replace Rabin. And the key thing about Rabin and Arafat, even though they had fought each other repeatedly, and I just wrote an article on this, and if your listeners are interested, I'll be happy to send it to them. They talked about the courage to change axioms. They said, we've buried our children. You've buried your children. All we want is a piece of land, some love, some joy from the flowers, and you want that too. Why can't we get it? Let's put an end to these wars. And that was the basis for a potential peace. Now, in 2001, Bibi Netanyahu said, I take credit for sabotaging Oslo, because he was the one who put forward this idea that Rabin is a traitor. That trading land for peace is giving up the Jewish homeland. And so they had rabbis put out a death warrant on Rabin, what's called the Din Rodef, because and one of these crazy guys took it seriously and shot and killed him. That's what you're dealing with this hatred and this fundamentalism, and it exists on the Jewish side and on the Islamic side. You know, we can say all we want about the craziness of Islamic fundamentalists. You got the same thing in Judaism, and unfortunately the same thing in Christianity. People who are hoping that this will lead to the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus. So now, does Biden factor all of that in? I don't think he does. No. But the Council on Foreign Relations does. The Atlantic Council does, and they play these things up. And Blinken certainly does. And so we're stuck in this war that could become a regional war, especially if people like Lindsey Graham and Joe Lieberman and those types are listened to, who say it's Iran, it's Iran, it's Iran. Now, even the U.S. intelligence community, as corrupt as it is, has said they have no evidence that Iran was behind Hamas. Hamas is Sunni, Iran is Shiite. They're not the same thing. No. Iran's proxy is Hezbollah. So, you know, if you pull this apart, if people were rational enough, if the State Department, if the Defense Department were rational enough and not corrupt, they could figure it out. But meanwhile, what does another $100 billion mean? It means more for Raytheon, more for McDonnell Douglas, for Lockheed Martin. And who's our Secretary of Defense? Former board member of Raytheon. Who are all these think tanks that are saying Iran is the problem? You have to kick out the Palestinians. They're all funded by these military-industrial complex firms. So when you talk about the merchants of whatever you said at the beginning,
chaos, control, conflict, and casualties.
Yeah. They run the disinformation industrial complex. They run the military industrial complex. They run the president. They run the Congress. The only thing they don't run is the minds of the American people, but they've done a pretty good job of dulling those minds. So I'm happy to say some things that will shock people, because maybe sometimes the first step toward looking for truth is to get a shock.
Well, speaking of truth, you know, there's a book written in 1928, almost 100 years ago, entitled The Falsehood in Wartime by Arthur Ponsonby. And he wrote, quote, "When war is declared, truth is the first casualty."
Yeah.
And it truly is. Harley, when you mentioned earlier October 7th, 2023. Harley, what I call the bought off lamestream fake media, the governments, a number of governments around the world have said, okay, on October 7th, 2023, these group of terrorist savages killed innocents in Israel. That's true. Savages, terrorists, innocents died in Israel. Yeah. But here's the question that those same governments, the bought off lamestream fake media, they don't want people to ask this question. And I ask you this, Harley. Israel is arguably one of the most well-trained, well-outfitted, well-financed militaries. The same is true of their intelligence agencies, Mossad, Shin Bet, Unit 8200. It has been stated their border security system is the most technologically superior border security system that can pick up a flock of birds from a mile out and deal with them before they'd even get to the fencing structure. So the question is, the syndicate does not want to asked, let alone answered, how in the world did a group of terrorists that had been training for months reportedly in Lebanon, how in the world did these folks or individuals using pickup trucks, bulldozers, hang gliders, drones, overcome one of the most sophisticated militaries, intelligence systems, and border security systems, and have a surprise in quotes, land, sea, and air attack? Harley?
Well, that's the question that you're right, they don't want to have answered.
No.
But here's the interesting thing to me about it. It is conceivable that if you know something about Netanyahu and the state of mind of his people, they do feel innately superior. Mm-hmm. They underestimate Hamas as they underestimate Hezbollah. They overestimate the aura of power that they've created. Now, does that mean that they could be caught off guard? Possibly. However, look at the other side of it. Netanyahu needed this. This was manna from heaven for Netanyahu.
Yeah, he did.
He's been faced with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demanding that he resign because of the corrupt attempt to change the judiciary in Israel to protect himself. He was doing this for a one-person protection. And the fact that Israel Defense Forces reservists were prominent in the marches against him let him know, and his controllers know, that something had to be done to consolidate him. So certainly he could use this, but who else needed it? Biden, Sunak, von der Leyen, the NATO war hawks, because they've run into this brick wall on Ukraine. It's not just Matt Gaetz, although Gaetz did a pretty good job raising the issue. It's the American people. We don't want to spend another $100 billion on a losing war. And so Biden needed something. And I'm not saying the U.S. sabotaged Israel's intelligence and security so this could happen. But again, it's a gift from heaven. And what Biden immediately did is he said, okay, let's take the congressional support for Israel, which comes from the Israel lobby, the AIPAC, these kinds of organizations, and also maybe some goodwill that goes back to people who think that we should help Israel because of what happened in World War II. But whatever it is, Biden knew that the Democrats would be 100% behind a spending package for Israel, as would the Republicans, including Donald Trump, who went out and really discredited himself in Las Vegas at this Republican Jewish conference last week, where he bragged about how close he is to Miriam Adelson, whose husband helped bankroll his campaigns, and he promised them he would move the capital of the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. So you have the Republicans and the Democrats and the media uh, committed to the defense of Israel. Now, could you connect that effectively to Ukraine so you can get a joint package? And that's what Biden tried to do.
Right.
And fortunately, there are some people in the Republican Party, and I think increasingly some in the Democratic Party, who are starting to say this is a dead horse. We can't win this war. Let's cut our losses. NBC News had a story the other day saying that there's administration people are talking to Ukraine about some kind of negotiated settlement. Well, why did they not accept a negotiated settlement in March and April of 2022?
That's right.
So that maybe 300,000 or 400,000 Ukrainians would still be alive. So, even if they are belatedly reaching this point, this is war crimes. The war hawks in the United States and NATO, who try to keep their hands clean, let's let the Ukrainians do it. I mean, they brag. Lindsey Graham says this is cheap for us to give $100 billion and let the Ukrainians die against Russia. Well, those people should be hauled before criminal courts.
Yes, they should.
And they're the same people responsible for the American deaths in Iraq and in Afghanistan, because these wars were unnecessary wars also. So the question that I would pose is, the false flags and things like that are a fact of history. They've happened quite often. Whether that's the case or not, Netanyahu's going to have to stand up and face the music on that. And he's even said, well, after we finish wiping out Hamas, then we'll have an investigation. And he's hoping that by then he'll be Saint Bibi and they wouldn't possibly move against him. But, we'll find out at some point what exactly happened. I'm pretty certain we will, because people in Israel are more open to leaking and getting out the story than the American intelligence community about 9/11, because they're still covering that up. So if this comes out, what does that mean for Israel? Well, I think Israel is going to need, if they keep this fight going, they're going to need tens or 20, $30 billion more from the United States. They can't afford a long war. And they can't, and Netanyahu said today, Israel will provide security for Gaza. Well, how is that different than the occupation?
That's right.
This is Intifada 3 in the making. So, unless there's a big shift in Washington, these wars are going to continue, and they may escalate to a full-scale World War III and a nuclear confrontation.
And that's my concern, Harley. Right now we've had Biden or whoever's dispatched 2 carrier groups.
Yeah.
One of which, the Eisenhower, has been put through the Suez Canal, is now in the Red Sea as we're recording this, and coming around the Straits of Djibouti, headed toward the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
Well, Harley, I go back to Pearl Harbor, right? And there is documentation that we were aware of an impending attack or potential attack.
And of the vulnerability of our forces there. Yeah.
And that nothing was done. And that launched us into this massive escalation into World War II. I'm concerned, Harley, as the Eisenhower goes around those Straits of Djibouti and toward the Straits of Hormuz, what happens if the Eisenhower, and as you mentioned, the hypersonic technology is drastically superior, and according to military individuals that I know who are very knowledgeable on weapon systems, we don't have a defense for the hypersonic missiles.
And in fact, the Russians have deployed some of these missiles in the Black Sea,
Yeah.
in their Black Sea fleet, that have the range that could hit those areas. Iran has some hypersonic missiles. So this is setting up a trap.
Yeah.
And, what happens if something occurs on the Eisenhower or the other one, the USS Gerald Ford? Well, you are in a situation where we could be staring at something much closer to nuclear war than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
With no John Kennedy
Right.
to hold back the war hawks. So it's a very dangerous situation. And I think what we're doing, what my organization is doing, is we're telling people that you cannot, just because it's so horrible to think about, you can't not think
That's
about
right.
potential consequences. Face them. Face your fears. And as Kennedy famously said, we will never negotiate out of fear, but we must never fear to negotiate. And that's the problem when you say no ceasefire, no talks about Ukraine with Russia. You're cutting off an avenue. And just quickly, one further point. Here in Germany, the three parties that make up what's called the traffic light coalition, the red, yellow, and green, the Social Democrats, the Free Democrats, and the Greens, their polls are now, the three of them together, under 30%. The AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which some people say is a right-wing, Trump-type Nazi party, is now the second largest party to the Christian Democrats. And now there's a new party, the former leader of the Linkspartei, the Left Party, who's actually a very sharp woman, Sarah Wagenknecht. She just left the Left Party to form a new party, and they're at about 20-something%. Now you look at France, Macron was never much more than 33% of the support.
That's right.
You look at Sunak's about 2 or 3%. So all these governments that are totally we're with Ukraine till the end, you can count on us, they're going to be gone. What are the people in these countries going to do? And it's in the self-interest in Germany to find out who the hell blew up those pipelines.
That's
because
right.
no one's going to be able to afford electricity this winter. And it was an enemy act, and it was probably done, as Seymour Hersh has said, by the Biden administration. And why? Well, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, the beginning of the 20th century geopolitics. One of the major principles of British geopolitics is you must never have an alliance between Germany and Russia, because German technology, science, and economics with Russian raw materials and the large market would outstrip what the British Empire could do. And so we're still, and this is what led to World War I and World War II, and it puts us on the edge of World War III. So people have to think about this, but recognize there are solutions. And that's what I think we're seeing with the emergence of the BRICS, the Global South, the potential to, because of the weaponization of the dollar, these countries are saying we don't want the dollar anymore.
That's right.
They're not anti-American, they're anti-corporate cartel. They're against the Federal Reserve. They see that their enemy is the same enemy that you and I see in our own country. And we could link up with them if we weren't so convinced of our own innate superiority.
Harley, I am deeply concerned that we are not only heading to escalation, but something that you spoke about. We're heading into a nuclear conflict. I believe I'm an old guy, and I was alive, a kid, but alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This, I believe, in my lifetime, is the closest we are to a nuclear event. And Harley, I've been criticized for this, and I'd like your take on this. I've told people, if you're going to count on the existing political class to de-escalate this, if you're going to count on whomever to de-escalate this, it ain't going to happen. The only way this de-escalates, Harley, and maybe some people believe this is naive, but I've seen it in action before, is every person contact their, and I use this term loosely, elected representatives in the Congress, the House, the Senate, the White House, even their state legislatures, even their local, and say, listen, We're wise to this war thing and this racket thing. We're wise to the money laundering operation that's occurring with this. And here's the bottom line. Number one, what are you doing, elected congressman, senator, governor, president? What are you doing to de-escalate this situation and minimize the loss of innocent lives? What are you doing? And if that person cannot give you an answer as far as the steps that they're taking, then you tell them, guess what? We are either going to get you recalled. We are going to have somebody run against you in the primary. We are going to remove you from your seat of power peacefully, but remove you because we're going to replace you with someone who's going to make the loss of life infinitesimal, if not even occur, and de-escalate the situation. Harley, many people say that can never work. Harley, I've seen it work on many other issues.
Well,
why wouldn't it work there with that?
It worked on Obama with Syria.
Yes.
People may not know this, but Obama was prepared and actually gave the orders for an escalation against the Syrian government on behalf of what were Islamic terrorists. The U.S. was ready to do that. And there was an outpouring of opposition, partly against Obama, partly against Hillary Clinton, who was pushing for this, the idea of a no-fly zone and fighting with Russia. But there was so much opposition, the Congress pulled it back, and they went to Obama and said, you can't do this. So it does work. But I want to just say something about your first point on this. If anybody thinks there are saner heads in the intelligence community, the Joint Chiefs, the Congress, the Defense Department, you haven't been paying attention.
That's right.
There are no saner heads or adults in the room. They have for rent signs on their forehead. There's no quality strategic thinking except for handfuls of people like Lieutenant Colonel Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter. There are a handful of people with military experience who completely reject the approach of the Biden administration and are warning, exactly as we are talking, about the danger of nuclear war by accident. So, you can't rely on the idea that there's somewhere a cavalry, white hats on horses who are going to ride in and save the day. It's going to require the American people. And this is something that Americans are not used to. But we did see, the other time we saw something like this was it started around the 2008 crash, where you had Occupy Wall Street on the left and you had the Tea Party on the right. And the two of them had the same basic concern. We're broke. We're bailing out the speculators and the criminals and throwing out onto the street the honest people and workers. But they couldn't get together.
No.
And I'm not talking about a left-right coalition, because left and right don't mean anything.
That's right.
I'm talking about people who are concerned about the future, who want to make sure that 10, 15, 20 years from now, if someone says, what were you doing when Biden was taking us to nuclear war? You could say, I acted. I got my friends to act. I did something. That's the American reflex. And that's what we need right now. And anybody who thinks it won't work is putting your future in the hands of a geriatric case. And whether he's the one making the decisions or not, he's the front man for it. And the people who have made these policies for him are the ones who are going to make the decisions, unless we get that kind of reaction rippling through the Congress. And we saw a little bit of it around the whole Ukraine vote and the dumping of Kevin McCarthy and so on. Some of that is just a legislative manipulation. But what was important was certain people stood on principle and said, we will not accept this. And that's what makes the difference. And that's why I go back to Kennedy, because when he was being pushed to bomb the Russian sites in Cuba by all of his advisors, including at one point his brother Bobby was saying, well, maybe we should do that. John Kennedy pretty much stood alone, and ironically with Adlai Stevenson, and they said, we can't do this. Mm-hmm. And we saw a glimmer of that in Trump when he came in and said, we're not going to go to war. Mm-hmm. We can't afford it. We should be friends with Russia, friends with China. I don't see that same fight coming out of him right now. I mean, he's prepared to fight wars against the judicial system, which he should do. Mm-hmm. But I would really appreciate it if President Trump said, we're not going to have any of these wars, instead of saying, I stand with Israel.
Yeah, and I think, Harley, one of the ramifications of their legal war against Trump is to wear him down on the legal front so that he's, if you will, he's not as vigorous on the international front for peace and negotiation because they're wearing him down on the domestic legal front.
Yeah, he's looking over his shoulder all the time.
Right.
Who's coming to stab me in the back?
Right.
And look, that happened during Russiagate.
Absolutely.
But he did stand up and fight it. And now it turns out everything you and I were talking about during the whole Russiagate thing, we were right. No. And people who said we were conspiracy theorists are proven to be simpletons and fools.
And bought and paid for.
Yeah.
I go back to George Orwell from his book 1984, Harley. Quote, "The war is not meant to be won. It's meant to be continuous. Hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. In principle, the war effort is always planned to keep society on the brink of starvation." End quote. He told us 40 years
distraction.
Ago. Right?
Weapons of mass distraction.
Yeah.
That's what our media is.
Yeah. Harley, I'd like to thank you for your time today, but also thank you for your decades of service to the people of the world. You, as we mentioned earlier, you're beyond a truth teller. You are incredible. You provide wisdom that's unfortunately in short supply in our country and our world. And you know, Harley, someone as wise as yourself, one could easily understand why you would stay back, not poke your head above the wall. But Harley, you do that 24/7. And it's because you care more about people than you do yourself.
I think that should be an innate characteristic of human beings.
I agree.
If people are true to their religious beliefs, if you think about most religions, mm-hmm. that's what we're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And there's this very interesting comment about the Middle East from it's a Yiddish proverb, but it's one God, so many enemies. Yeah. If we all have this idea of a one creator mm-hmm. that created all of us and imbued us with a capacity to make discovery and to love our neighbor, why are we fighting?
Right.
And I think this is the message of the Schiller Institute. We need to talk. We need to have diplomacy. We need to shock people into thinking and facing the truth. Mm-hmm. But once you face the truth, you realize, well, you only have one life anyway. Do something good with it. Mm-hmm. Do something that will make future generations, even if they don't know your name, glad that you were around at this time in history.
Harley, educate our listeners in how they can stay in touch with you on a daily basis and consume as much as your content is available. What's the best means of following you?
Well, I do a daily or 5 days a week, 10 to 12 minute video update mm-hmm. where I take events of the day and put it into the historical context mm-hmm. as we've been talking. That's available through LaRoucheOrganization.com. It's sometimes on Facebook, sometimes on YouTube, but you know, whenever I have a big spike in views, it disappears the next week.
Right.
But if you go to but LaRoucheOrganization.com and click on at the top programs, and what will pop up is Harley Update, and you can click on that. You can sign up so you get notifications. I post articles there. That's the best way to be in touch with me. And then secondly, from the schillerinstitute.com, I do a weekly webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And Helga's been at the forefront of this fight. She was the wife of Lyndon LaRouche. In China, they call her the Silk Road Lady because she popularized the idea of turning the old Silk Road into the new land bridge. So we have discussions, 40 or so minute discussion once a week, and that's available through the schillerinstitute.com website.
Harley, I'd like to thank you for your perseverance, dedication, and sacrifice, and for everything you have done, are doing, and will do. And I thank you folks for joining us. Until next time, Dave Janda signing off. Dream big and dare to fail. Thanks for your time today.